Good morning. Welcome to part two of Leading a Crisis. I'm Walker Armstrong, the Executive Director of the Pilot Mountain Baptist Association, and for the next few weeks we're going to be looking at how to lead in a time like this. We used a tool last week I called the Leadership Loop, and thanks to Robert Dixon for reminding me to reverse print this week. And the Leadership Loop is simply a diagnostic and development tool that looks at how we lead and what we lead. Oftentimes when you study leadership, you have two schools of thought. You have the school of thought that says it's most important who we are, character, and others will turn around and say, well, character is important, but if we don't know what we're doing, we miss the boat. So competence is equally important. And what I would say to you this morning, once again, is that you can't artificially separate character from competence. They need to flow into each other to create the widest possible relational influence and the deepest possible organizational impact. Last week we looked at leadership, a definition of leadership, as a catalytic process whereby an individual or individuals influences others and impacts organizations to move together towards an aspirational goal. To put it another way, leaders bring change to people and organizations by helping them move together towards something that's a common shared value or goal. And last week we began to look at the path of influence, and the first step of that path being leaning into your story. Now, what do we mean by that, leaning into your story? When you lead, first and foremost, you lead from who you are, the totality of who you are. Thus, if your story is a narrative, an ongoing story, you lead from the good, the bad, and the ugly of all your life experiences and your abilities and weaknesses and strengths. And we looked at that and got at that one way of thinking about it in terms of our stories are about our home life, how we grew up, our heroes, the people we looked up to that we wanted to model, our highlights, that is the things that we've accomplished where we felt like we were competent and capable and we made a positive impact, and finally, our heartaches. All four of those areas influence us as leaders, but we dove particularly into our heartaches to see how our heartaches influence us, sometimes unconsciously as leaders. And one of the things we looked at is there's three ways we can break our heartaches down. It's through wickedness, the mistakes we make, the wrong motivations we have, which for as Christians we call that sin. There's weaknesses, the fact that we're not omnicompetent, we don't have all the gifts, we don't have all the abilities. And finally, there's woundedness. There are things that people have done to us in our past that have negatively impacted us. And so when we're trying to understand how we're leaning into our story, we ask a diagnostic question: am I driven or am I led? You see, when you're driven, you're leading unconsciously or subconsciously from something that's unresolved in your life. We would oftentimes call that brokenness. And if it's pride, if it's shame, if it's bitterness, that is a bad motivator and bad foundation to lead from as a leader. And so we saw last week that the counteractive response to that, or the antidote to that, is to be led versus to be driven. And to be led as a Christian is someone who has a sense that there's something higher, more important, and more significant leading them than just their own abilities. And we looked last week, particularly at the life of Paul, and saw how Paul had these two fundamental realities working his life, one being grace and another being the sovereignty of God. The grace of God saved Paul and called Paul. That is, that he had nothing to prove because he recognized that he wasn't called based on his own merit or abilities. He was called based on the grace of God. And equally important to Paul was the sovereignty of God. Not only was he called by the goodness and the mercy and merits of God working in his life, but he's also called by the plan of God or sovereignty of God. When we become Christians, it's not so much that we invite Jesus into our lives, although that's true, but even on a grander scale, we get invited into his. It's not just that he's invited into our stories, but we get invited into his grander narrative. And those two things, the grace of God and the sovereignty of God, produce within a leader the foundational value of humility. Now, I've never met anybody in the time that I've been teaching on this that said we didn't need humble leaders, whether they believe it or not. I mean, all you have to do is look at our current political climate and see how both sides of the aisles often do not demonstrate humility. And thus, we can track the problems in our nation and attribute them oftentimes to a lack of humility. Humility is a fundamental and foundational value that if we don't operate from, we create dissonance in our lives and problems. So this week, we want to look at the second step in that path of influence, which is living according to your convictions. What does that mean? Well, all of us have values. If I was to give you a list of 75 values, commonly held values, many of us might check off 20 or 25 of those values as resonating with us, seeming to be important with us. But if I ask you to cull those down further and keep cutting them down to 15, to 10, to 5, and maybe even 3, what those things represent are your core values or core convictions. I think of convictions as values on steroids. Those core beliefs, those core ideals that we would stake our lives on. That's what it's about. And so oftentimes when we talk about what motivates us as people to do what we do, we're really talking about our core convictions, our core values. And when we talk about that, it's really important to think, if we can, in terms of maybe no more than 3 basic core convictions we operate from. Depending on who you read in this field, Jim Collins, the famous business guru, says that no organization and no individual can operate beyond 3 major priorities. And that makes a lot of sense to me. So oftentimes, as I think about my own life and I try to help others, I really try to push myself and encourage others to think about 3 core convictions they operate from. Now, what happens with us is we need to ask a diagnostic question to understand if we're operating from these core convictions. Am I being hypocritical or am I trustworthy? Think about that for a minute. Am I being hypocritical or am I being trustworthy? Now we know that the word hypocrite comes from Greek tragedy plays from several millennia ago, in which there were a limited number of actors. And so the way they would represent roles is that an actor might play 3 or 4 roles in a play. And instead of going off stage to change costume, they would simply shift masks that they handheld to shift roles. That's where we get the word from. So oftentimes to be hypocritical is to be wearing a mask, to be pretending to be something you're not. To put it in another broad way or general way is to think of not doing what you encourage others to do. Not doing what you say is important. Now, what happens oftentimes, and usually, when we're being hypocritical or inconsistent, is we create dissonance. That is, if people are following us and they look deeply into our lives or follow us closely enough, they begin to see some inconsistencies. Not imperfections necessarily, but inconsistencies. And those inconsistencies create dissonance. I mean, that's the idea of something being out of tune or out of harmony. I don't know about you, but have you ever seen someone who thought they could sing, whether in church or online or something? It's a disturbing picture when you think about it. You want to reach out to that person and try to maybe compassionately let them know that maybe there's something else they should be doing with different talents. Dissonance is like that in a leader's life. People see stark inconsistencies and they cause them to pull away. I mean, what does this look like in regards to faithfulness? Faithfulness is about being consistent. We find a picture of that in the scriptures in Matthew chapter 7, verses 25 through 27 at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus wraps up the greatest sermon ever preached by comparing 2 different types of people. The first is a person who says one thing but lives another way. And the second person is a person who seeks to say and do what they believe to be right. And he compares them to 2 houses, one built on sand and one built upon a rock. Storms come to both these houses, and the one built on sand falls, and the one built upon the rock remains. Stability. Nobody expects a leader to be perfect, but they do want a leader to be consistent. Now, oftentimes when we talk about values in regards to this, there's a difference between aspirational values and actual values. What do I mean by that? Well, like I said earlier, you might pick a list of values that make a lot of sense to you, that you like to live by. But when push comes to shove and when crisis happens, like we're in right now, how do you lead? Those are your actual values. And the core value behind living according to your convictions is the value or core conviction of integrity. Integrity. Now we borrow that from math. Integrity means a pattern, a consistent pattern. We're not talking about perfection again. No leader is perfect, but we are talking about consistency. Integrity is the commitment to consistently live according to our core convictions, regardless of cost or circumstantial pressure. It's the commitment to live according to your core convictions, no matter what it costs you, no matter what's happening around you. And in this time period that we're in right now, it's essential that leaders live according to their core convictions. Followers need leaders that are consistent. We don't have to have all the answers. We don't have to have it all together. But at a bare minimum, we've got to be operating from our core convictions. We've got to be people of integrity. So how do we activate those core convictions? How do we develop them? Here's 3 word pictures I want to give you as we wrap up this morning to think about. The first word picture is the idea of a filter. To think of values as this great filter in your life. I don't know about you, but I like to cook. And oftentimes in developing different layers and sauces, you have to filter out the large parts to get to the essence of what you're trying to achieve. Core convictions are like that. They are the things that represent what you want to do and are most important to you. Brene Brown, who's written a lot of great stuff on shame and empathy, has written an excellent book I'd recommend to you called Dare to Lead. And she approaches this idea of core convictions or core values in the following way. Here are 3 questions that she asks. Number 1, does this define me? If someone was to look at me and say, how would I define Walker? Would they list what I think are my core convictions? A second question she asks, is this who I am at my very best? So when I'm operating at an optimum level as a leader, are these core convictions part of what I am and what I'm doing? And thirdly, can I use these values to make hard decisions? The idea of a filter. Because if we can't integrate values into what we're doing, what happens eventually is there's great inconsistency. So oftentimes we need to think about values as being a great filter by which we make decisions. The second word picture I want to give you is this idea of channel, like a river or a channel of positive energy. Values, for them to really matter, have to connect from heart to heart, from life to life. They've got to come across as genuine or sincere. And if they do, they have a high level of positive and proactive impact. Here are 3 questions you can ask to see if your values, your core convictions are acting like a channel of positive energy. Number 1 is, what most quickly engages your emotional energies? What moves you the deepest? It's very important. Oftentimes we teach leadership and treat leadership as if it's just some cognitive process. It's just some logical, sequential theory that we use and we implement. And I will tell you right now, if you don't positively use the energy of your emotions, you can't influence other people. There's just no way. What moves you? Secondly, what are the values or convictions or beliefs that best represent what moves you? What can you correlate from a belief system standpoint and a conviction standpoint to those core energies, emotional energies? And third, how have I seen these convictions bring positive change to other people? Can I think of a time when my core convictions have positively impacted another person? That's one way of looking at it as a channel of energy. And the third and final word picture I want to give you this morning is a refining fire. That is that core convictions, if they're true core convictions, stand the test of time. They grow and develop and grow in their greater impact over time. They don't diminish with time. You think of the cauldron, where you put a precious metal in that cauldron and heat it up to an unbelievable high temperature in order that the impurities may rise, and that what's remain is even more valuable. That's like core convictions. Over time, especially through adversity, if these core convictions are true and operational in our lives, they'll become more important, not less important. Here are 3 questions to ask us in that process. What particular way has this core conviction worked out in my own personal development? Secondly, how have trials or hard times driven these core convictions deeper into my life? And third, what are some examples of how I've seen this ability to grow in the midst of adversity bring positive impact to others? In fact, oftentimes I think one of the most important things that people are looking for in leaders is transparency. We might use a phrase that a leader is a real, quote unquote, person. What we really mean by that is that we see their weaknesses. We hear their stories of overcoming failure and defeat. And those stories move us deeply because we can resonate and relate to people who struggle. And a leader's not someone who places themselves above others to the degree that they're not relatable. The most effective leaders are people who are transparent and real about their own struggles and show, if you're a Christian, show how God's grace and His sovereignty have worked in your life to help you overcome these things. So here's some assessment questions at the end I want to ask us all today as we think about living according to our convictions. Number 1, do you know why you do what you do as a leader? Do you know your core motivations as a leader? Secondly, can you name at least 3 core convictions that have positively shaped your life? And third, can you give a few examples of how your core convictions have helped your children or your mate or your friends or people at work or people in your community? As we think about the day and time in which we live, it's not so much that people are looking for quick and easy answers. I think most people understand that that's just not the case. We don't need that in a leader. If someone has quick and easy answers, you should probably run in the opposite direction. But what we're looking for is people who try to lead according to their values. So during this time, allow God to deepen your core values to give you a greater sense of personal stability. See how these core convictions can help people in your neighborhood, in your community, in your church, in your workplace. And see how they can help you motivate people, inspire people, challenge people, resource people for greater good. I look forward to our next time together. God bless.